My son-in-law grabbed my wrist that night and gave it a slow, deliberate twist. Not enough to leave a bruise, not enough to send me to a hospital, but exactly enough to send a message. The message was simple. He believed he had become the man of the house. He believed I had become a guest in my own home. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just looked at him for a long second, pulled my arm free, walked down the hallway to my bedroom, and started folding shirts into an old canvas duffel bag. The next morning, while I was loading my pickup truck 2 miles away, my daughter was throwing a brunch on the back patio of my house in Boston. She raised a glass of mimosa, surrounded by her friends, and laughed loud enough that my old neighbor could hear from across the fence. She said, "Finally, this place feels like ours." She had no clue that the certified envelope was already moving through the postal system, and she had absolutely no idea about the man who was sitting in a parked sedan across the street, watching her through tinted glass with a notebook open on his lap. Before we go any further, I want you to do me a small favor. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from, and let's begin, because what I'm about to share with you is the slowest, most patient kind of justice I've ever built with my own 2 hands. You see, I'm a carpenter from the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. 41 years working with hardwood, mostly old colonial restoration jobs around Beacon Hill and the South End. My name is Walter, and I've spent more nights than I can count in workshops smelling of cedar shavings and machine oil. That smell never quite washes off. My wife passed 11 years ago from a stroke that came out of nowhere on a quiet Sunday morning, and since then it's been just me, the house, and a daughter named Marisol who used to bring her school books to my workbench when she was 8 years old. I tell you this because I want you to understand that when she came to me 2 years ago and said she needed help, I didn't even hesitate. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I think this is the part where most of us go wrong. We say yes to family before we ask the right questions. I know I did. And honestly, if I could go back to that afternoon when Marisol sat on my porch with her husband and asked if they could move into the spare bedrooms, I'd probably still say yes. That's the truth. Love makes carpenters out of fools sometimes. We try to build bridges where maybe a fence would have served us better. That evening, when everything began to shift, I pulled into my driveway around 7 in the evening, my hands still gritty from a day spent milling crown molding for a brownstone restoration on Commonwealth Avenue. I had been helping my old friend Roy at his shop. Roy and I have known each other since 1987, since the days when Boston still had cheap rent and good record stores. The kind of tired I felt that day was a good tired, honest work, slow and methodical, the kind that quiets your head. The house was lit up like a stadium when I came through the side gate, every single window glowing. There was music thumping from the back patio, something with too much bass and not enough melody. My daughter's Honda was parked next to her husband's pickup truck. His truck was angled badly, with one wheel resting on the lawn I'd seeded just last spring. I noticed that wheel. I noticed everything those days, but I didn't say a word. I walked through the kitchen the way I always had, and the kitchen smelled wrong. It smelled like burnt sugar and something chemical underneath, like a candle from a discount store. 3 pots were stacked unwashed in the sink. A half-empty bottle of California Red was sweating on the counter, and right next to it sat the walnut cutting board I'd carved by hand in 1994, now stained with rings of wine that nobody had bothered to wipe up. I'm going to be honest with you, that cutting board hurt me more than the wrist twist did. I made that board the year my wife was pregnant. I sanded it down on 3 different evenings while she sat next to me eating saltines because the morning sickness wouldn't quit. So when I saw those red rings, something old and slow began to move inside my chest. Not anger exactly. Something more careful than anger. I hung my keys on the hook by the door and walked into the living room. My daughter Marisol was curled on the sofa, eyes glued to her phone, laughing at something I couldn't see. Her husband Travis was sitting in my reading chair. Not the couch, not the recliner by the window, my chair. The leather wingback I'd bought before Marisol was born, reupholstered twice, worn soft at the armrests in the exact shape of my own forearms. He was watching some kind of action show on the television with the volume cranked up past comfortable. Neither of them looked up when I came in. Not a hello, not a glance. I want you to imagine that for a second. You walk into the home you've owned outright for 20-something years, the home where your daughter took her first steps, and the people living inside don't even raise their eyes from a screen. If you've ever been treated like you were invisible in your own house, I think you know exactly what I felt in that hallway. I walked over and turned the volume down 2 notches. Travis finally looked up. He had that look, patient on the surface, hostile underneath, like a man asked to wait in a line he believes is beneath him. He said, "What's the issue?" I told him calmly that the volume was too loud for that hour, that my neighbor Earl across the fence was 78 years old and went to bed early. Travis didn't answer me. He just picked up the remote and turned the volume back up. Not all the way, just one notch, just enough to make sure I knew he wasn't actually obeying me. Marisol still didn't look up from her phone, and in that silence, I think a small part of me understood something I had been refusing to understand for months. My daughter had stopped seeing me as her father. She had started seeing me as a fixed feature of the property, like a porch light, like a hose reel. I went to my bedroom, washed my hands at the sink, changed into a clean flannel shirt, and stood at the window for a while looking out at the backyard. The garden beds I had built along the fence were overgrown. The raised planters where I'd grown heirloom tomatoes and Cubanelle peppers every summer for almost a decade were full of weeds. Someone had left a folding table in the middle of the lawn, leg bent, abandoned from some recent gathering nobody had told me about. I went back to the kitchen and started boiling water for pasta. Just simple penne with olive oil and garlic, because I didn't have the energy for anything else. Marisol appeared in the doorway while the water heated. She said, "We already ate, Dad." I kept stirring. I told her there was enough if she wanted some. She lingered there for a moment, with that careful face she'd been wearing for the last 6 months. Not quite present, not quite gone. Measuring me. That's the only word for it. Measuring. Let me say this, because I think it matters. If you have an adult child who has started to look at you like you're a problem to be managed, like you're a bank account on legs, pay attention. Don't dismiss it. Don't tell yourself you're imagining things. I dismissed it for half a year, and I paid for that dismissal in ways I'm still recovering from. After dinner, I went to my study. I had converted the smallest bedroom into a workspace years ago. Bookshelves on 2 walls, a drafting table where I still drew furniture plans by hand because computers never felt right for that work, a reading lamp I'd built from a piece of reclaimed white oak salvaged from a barn in Vermont. My father's tools hung on a pegboard above the table, chisels, hand planes, marking gauges, each one oiled, sharpened, kept in working order even though my father had been dead since 1996. That room was the heart of the house. I sat down with a paperback I'd been reading. I got through maybe 4 pages before I heard Travis on the phone in the hallway. He was speaking louder than he needed to, the way men do when they want to feel important. And then I heard 2 words that froze me, equity, and then a phrase. Not in his name alone. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there with the book open on my lap, listening. The call ended. His footsteps passed my door without slowing. I closed the book very carefully, set it on the side table, and just sat in the quiet of that lamplight for what felt like a long time. The next morning was a Saturday. I came down before either of them was awake, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I pulled up the Suffolk County Registry of Deeds. My property, my name on the title. No liens, no co-owners. I knew this already, but I needed to see it on the screen. Then I checked my email. There were 3 messages from a financial services company I had never contacted. The subject lines all referenced a home equity inquiry, and they were addressed to me at my home address. I had not initiated any home equity inquiry in my life. Something in me went very still. I forwarded those emails to a private account, then deleted them from the family inbox I had foolishly given Marisol access to 2 years earlier, when she was helping me sort some bills after my wife's estate paperwork was finalized. I changed every password I could remember, and then I sat there sipping my coffee, looking out at the bird feeder, and I understood that I was no longer dealing with rude behavior. I was dealing with something far more deliberate. If you're watching this and you've ever shared an email password with a family member, please go change it tonight. I'm serious. Tonight, before you sleep. That's a free piece of advice that might save you a lot of money and a lot of grief. The American Bankers Association estimates that financial elder abuse costs older Americans somewhere around $3 billion every year, and the majority of it is committed by family members, not strangers. Family. Let that sit for a second. That afternoon I drove to the Boston Public Library on Boylston Street and sat at one of the research terminals for nearly 4 hours. I treated this the way I treated any difficult carpentry job. You start with what you know is solid, and you build outward. I pulled the public business filings on Travis's company, Heartline Construction LLC, registered in Massachusetts roughly 4 years earlier. The status was listed clearly: dissolved, not struggling, not active. Dissolved 18 months prior to that very day. Marisol didn't know, or if she knew, she had been protecting him from me knowing. I printed it, Then I searched his name alongside court records and found a civil judgment from 3 years back. A contractor dispute, $4,200. Small but messy. Then a larger one from a county further west. A lender had sued him over an unpaid business line of credit. The amount listed was $68,000. The case had been marked settled, but the filing was public record. I wrote down the case number. Then I typed his name and the words previous address and stumbled into a small-town newspaper archive from a county 2 hours west of Boston. There, in the legal notices section, was a Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing in his name from 6 years back, before he ever met my daughter, before he ever stepped foot in our family. I leaned back in that library chair and just stared at the screen for a while. My daughter had married a man whose financial history was a roadmap of other people's losses, and that man was now living rent-free under my roof, attempting to pull equity out of my house using my own name. I drove home the long way that night, took the back roads through Jamaica, Plain, and Roslindale, just to think. I rolled the window down and let the cold autumn air hit me in the face. I did not go in hot. That's not how a real carpenter works. When you hit a knot in the grain, you don't slam the chisel through it. You stop, you assess, you change your angle, you preserve the piece. I was going to preserve this piece if it was the last thing I did. If you're listening to this story right now and you're nodding along because something similar has happened in your own family, I want you to hear me say this clearly. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. You are not being a bad parent for protecting yourself. The hardest betrayals in this life almost always come from inside the house. And building your defense quietly, methodically, on paper, is not coldness, it is wisdom. Roy was at his workbench when I drove out to his place in Quincy that Sunday morning. He had known me longer than my marriage had lasted. He was the kind of friend you don't have to explain things to. I told him most of what I had found, not every detail, but enough to paint a picture. He set down his block plane and looked at me with those tired blue eyes. He asked me, "You think Marisol knows?" I told him honestly that I didn't know what she knew, but I knew what I had heard on that phone call. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and asked me how long I needed. I told him as long as it took to do this right. He just nodded and said the spare room over the garage was mine for as long as I needed. I drove home that afternoon and packed only what mattered. I made 3 slow trips wrapped in moving blankets to get my father's tools out of the study. The drafting table I left, but everything on it I took. The blueprints, the leather-bound notebooks, the photographs of my wife from before Marisol was born, the original deed to the house, my insurance binder, the will I had updated 4 months earlier with an attorney named Diane Pettigrew, a woman my accountant had recommended. Quiet, sharp, the type who returns calls within an hour. I packed 2 duffels of clothes. I took the walnut cutting board, and I left before Marisol came home from her Saturday shift at the dental office. I didn't leave a note. I left my house key on the kitchen counter where they would see it, and I wanted them to feel a little wave of relief. I wanted them to exhale and think the old man had finally given up. Because comfort is what makes people careless. That first night in Roy's spare room, lying on a futon under a window that rattled in the wind off Quincy Bay, I thought about timelines. The unauthorized equity inquiry was the cleanest thread I had. Someone had used my name and address to contact a lender. If Travis had gotten far enough to have a real conversation with that lender, there would be a paper trail. I needed to find out exactly how far he had gotten. Monday morning I called Diane Pettigrew. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I trusted about her. Then she asked 3 sharp questions. Was I the only name on the deed? Yes. Had I signed any document in the last 6 months, authorizing anyone to act on my behalf regarding the property? No. Did I have the email correspondence? Yes. Forwarded, time-stamped, intact. She was quiet for a long beat. Then she said, "Walter, that's potentially fraud. Identity-based mortgage fraud, in fact. Do you want to pursue it now or hold it?" I told her to hold it. I wanted to see the full picture before I pulled any triggers. She told me to come in Thursday with everything I had, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Most clients in your situation panic and act fast. You're acting like a carpenter. That's going to serve you well." I told her I appreciated that. I spent that week working at Roy's table. He left a desk lamp burning for me each evening and never once asked how things were going. That's the gift of a man who works with his hands. He understood that some jobs need silence to set up properly. I built the case the way I would have built a shaker dining chair. Mortise and tenon, glue and clamp, true joinery. I started with what was undeniably solid. The deed, the dissolution of Travis's LLC, the Chapter 7 bankruptcy, the civil judgments, the unauthorized equity inquiry. Then I added what I could verify with phone calls. I called the financial services company that had sent the emails. I identified myself as the property owner. I told the representative that I had not authorized any inquiry, and I asked, very politely, whether she would prefer that I involve the Massachusetts Attorney General's office before or after our conversation. She told me a preliminary online inquiry had been submitted using my name, my home address, and a partial Social Security number. The full credit pull had been blocked because the partial Social Security number didn't match the full record on file. He had tried. He had been stopped by a single mismatched digit, one digit between me and a second mortgage on my own house. I asked her to send written confirmation. She agreed. I added that confirmation to the folder. I want you to think about that for a moment. One digit, one number out of 9. That's how close it was. If you have elderly parents in your life, please consider helping them put a credit freeze on all 3 bureaus: Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. It's free. It takes 15 minutes online, and it can stop a Travis from ever happening to the people you love. Thursday with Diane lasted 90 minutes. She read everything twice. When she finally looked up, she said, "The unauthorized equity inquiry alone might not rise to a criminal conviction, but combined with the LLC dissolution he concealed and his prior history, you have a documented pattern. What outcome do you want?" I told her exactly what I wanted. I wanted my house back. I wanted them out of it under proper legal process. And I wanted Travis to understand that what he had attempted was now in a folder being held by more than one person. She nodded. She told me eviction was straightforward in Massachusetts given my sole ownership and the absence of any written 30 days notice required. She would file it that week. She suggested holding the fraud documentation until after they vacated, in case they tried to escalate or contest. If they left quietly, we still had it on the record. She filed the notice that same afternoon. The next morning I drove to the house when I knew Travis's truck would be gone. Marisol's car was there. I let myself in with my key. The house felt occupied in that strange way a place feels when somebody else's habits have settled into it. Different smells, different objects on every surface, coats on the hook that weren't mine. They had moved my furniture. My sofa was pushed to the far wall. A new glass-top coffee table sat in the middle of the room, the kind that shows every fingerprint within an hour. My reading chair was shoved into the corner near the window, halfway hidden behind a fake fern in a ceramic pot. My chair, sidelined. Even the furniture had been demoted to make room for them. I went room by room with my phone and photographed everything. The kitchen, where 3 of my custom cabinet doors had been removed for some open shelf aesthetic, Marisol had once mentioned in passing. The back bedroom, where someone had painted an entire wall a deep charcoal gray without ever asking me. The bathroom, where the framed mirror I had built and hung myself was gone, replaced with a frameless slab too large for the wall. I photographed it all calmly, methodically. Then I locked the door behind me and drove back to Roy's. The certified eviction notice landed in their mailbox 2 days later. I knew because Marisol called me within the hour. She said, "Dad, what is this?" I told her plainly. It was a legal notice to vacate. They had 30 days. She was quiet for a moment. Then her voice slid into that tone I remembered from her teenage years, the tone she used when she was sure the rules didn't apply to her. She said, "You can't do this to us. We live here." I told her she lived there for 2 years without a lease and without paying rent, in a house that belonged to me. That didn't mean she could stay forever. That was, in fact, exactly what it meant. I told her to talk to a lawyer if she wanted to confirm it. She hung up. Travis called 40 minutes later. His voice was different, flatter, harder, practiced. He said, "I think we need to have a real conversation." I said I agreed completely, and that he should have that conversation with my attorney, whose number was printed at the bottom of the notice. He paused. He told me I was making this into something it didn't need to be. I told him he made it into something the day he submitted my name to a lender without my knowledge. There was a long silence. Then he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, very calmly, "Written confirmation from the lender disagrees with you. I have it in my files." The line went dead. Roy brought turkey sandwiches to the workshop that evening, and we ate without talking for a while. Outside, his neighbor's kids were riding bikes in the street, the way kids do in summer. He finally asked me, "You think she knew what he was doing?" I had been turning that question over in my head all week. Marisol had her mother's intelligence, and also her mother's habit of looking away from things she didn't want to see. Whether she knew the specific scheme or whether she just knew the general direction her husband was heading and chose not to ask, I couldn't tell. Either way, she had let it happen under my roof. Either way, the house I had spent 40 years building a life inside was at risk because she had brought a man into it and stood quietly while he tested every load-bearing wall. I told Roy I didn't know what she knew, but it didn't change what I had to do. I want to stop here and say something to anyone listening who has ever felt torn between protecting yourself and protecting a child. Loving your child does not require letting yourself be destroyed by them. Those two things are not connected. You can love your daughter and still file a notice to vacate. You can love your son and still remove him from a joint bank account. Boundaries are not abandonment. Boundaries are how love survives. The next 2 weeks ran on 2 tracks at once, the visible track and the invisible track. The visible track was the eviction. Travis and Marisol hired a young attorney named Brennan, who sent Diane a letter arguing that 2 years of residence without a lease constituted an implied tenancy under Massachusetts law, and that the notice was retaliatory, filed in response to a minor family disagreement. Diane read it to me over the phone in a tone that made it clear she had heard this argument from many lawyers and had never once been impressed by it. The invisible track was a man named Theodore Rasmussen. I had found Theodore the way I had found everything else, through public records and patience. In Travis's bankruptcy filing from 6 years earlier, listed among the creditors was a company called Birch Grove Custom Builds, owed $41,000. I searched Birch Grove and found it was a small residential contractor, still operating, owner listed as Theodore Rasmussen, age 54, out of a small town in central Massachusetts. I cross-referenced his name with Travis's, and I found a separate civil suit Theodore had filed personally, alleging fraud and breach of contract, alleging that Travis had invoiced for materials never delivered, signed contracts for work never completed, and used Theodore's equipment and supplier accounts to take jobs and pocket the deposits. The suit had been dismissed when Travis declared bankruptcy. The debt had been absorbed into the proceeding, but the dismissal was procedural. The underlying facts had never been adjudicated. I wrote Theodore Rasmussen a letter, by hand, on real paper, because some communications deserve that kind of weight. I introduced myself plainly. I explained my situation. I told him that the man who had cost him $41,000 and several years of legal grief was now living rent-free in my home and had attempted to fraudulently submit my identifying information to a lender. I told him I had documentation. I told him I was not asking him for money or for involvement in anything illegal. I was simply extending the courtesy I would have wanted someone to extend to me. The information that the man who had wronged him had not changed direction. I included my phone number. He called me 4 days later. His voice had the quality of a man who had spent decades on construction sites. Direct, a little worn down. No wasted words. He told me he had thought about Travis Hartline more times than he could count over the years. He said the $41,000 was money he had never fully recovered, that it had set his company back 3 years and his marriage back even further. He asked me what I was planning to do. I told him about the eviction. I told him about the fraud documentation I was holding. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Walter, there's something you should know." He told me that before the bankruptcy and before the lawsuit, he had heard from another contractor in the region that Travis had pulled the same trick on a residential client, not a business, a homeowner, an older woman in her 70s who had hired Travis to build a sunroom onto her ranch house. Travis had taken a deposit of $12,000, done about $2,000 of framing work, and then stopped showing up, stopped returning calls, vanished. The woman had filed a complaint with the Massachusetts Office of Consumer Affairs, and Theodore didn't know how it had been resolved. I thanked him. I told him I would be in touch. I found that complaint that very same afternoon. It had been filed, but Worcester, but woman named Rosalind Vega, age 73, with an address in a small town south of Worcester. The complaint described exactly what Theodore had outlined. 12,000 taken, work abandoned, calls ignored. The board's resolution was listed as a 60-day license suspension and a partial fine. 60 days for $12,000 taken from a 73-year-old widow. I sat with that for a long time before I called Diane again. I want to pause once more. If you're listening and you have ever lost money to a contractor who walked off a job, you are not alone. The Better Business Bureau receives tens of thousands of contractor complaints every year in this country, and the majority of them go unresolved. If you ever hire someone for major homework, please do these things. Verify their license through your state's licensing board. Pull their business registration. Search their name plus the word lawsuit in your state's court records. It is free, it takes 20 minutes, and it could save you from being the next Rosalind Vega. When I told Diane about the new information, she listened the way she always did, without interruption, with the focus of someone taking careful mental notes. When I finished, she said, "The Vega complaint changes the character of what you have. You now have a documented pattern across multiple victims, 2 businesses and at least 1 elderly homeowner, occurring across years. The unauthorized equity inquiry against you may be part of the same pattern. I'd recommend we contact the Massachusetts Attorney General's Elder Fraud Division." I told her I wanted to time it correctly. She understood without needing me to explain. We would wait until after the eviction hearing, until they were out of the house. That way no one could argue we had filed criminally to influence a civil matter. I also told her I wanted to contact Rosalind Vega personally. Diane paused and asked me why. I told her that woman deserved to know her complaint hadn't been the end of his story, and when the AG's office eventually built a case, a corroborating witness from a separate incident would matter. Diane's tone shifted into something close to approval, and she said, "I'll let you handle that one personally." I found Rosalind Vega's number in a public directory, called on a Tuesday evening. She answered on the 3rd ring with that cautious tone older folks use for unfamiliar numbers. I introduced myself. I told her I was not selling anything, was not affiliated with any company, and was calling because I believed we had a person in common, and that the information might matter to her. She listened in silence while I spoke. When I was finished, she was quiet so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, in a voice I will never forget, "I knew he would do it again." It wasn't anger. It was something quieter than anger. It was the voice of a woman who had been right about something she desperately wished she had been wrong about. She told me her family had told her to move on, that the money was gone and the stress wasn't worth it, that she had moved on, mostly, but she had kept all her files. Every email, every voicemail transcript, every photograph of the half-built sunroom that had stood unfinished in her backyard for 2 summers before she paid someone else to tear it down. I asked her if she would speak with the AG's office when the time came. She said, "Walter, you give me the number and I'll call them myself." Marisol came to Roy's house 2 weeks into the process. She didn't call ahead. I heard the knock from the workshop where Roy and I were working on a rocking chair joint. She was standing on the porch when I opened the door, thinner than I remembered, although it hadn't been long. Something in her face had changed since the notice arrived. The careful, measuring quality I had noticed for months was gone. In its place was something raw and tired and almost childlike. She asked if she could come in. We sat at Roy's kitchen table. Roy disappeared into the workshop and pretended he had urgent business with a bandsaw. She started to say several things, stopped each time, and finally said, "Is there anything I can do to change your mind?" I looked at my daughter. I had held her on the day she was born at Beth Israel Hospital. I had driven her to school for 12 years and to college in upstate New York for 4 more. The last drive east on the Mass Pike with her car packed full of her dorm furniture, both of us quiet because we both knew it was a kind of small ending. I had walked her down the aisle at a wedding I had quiet misgivings about, misgivings I kept to myself because I believed in her judgment more than my own doubt. And here we were. I asked her, "Mari, do you know what Travis tried to do with this house?" She looked at the table. Her hands were flat on the wood, the way hands go when a person is fighting to stay steady. She said, "I know he made some inquiries." I said, "Inquiries?" "He submitted my name and my address and a partial social security number to a lender without my consent. If one digit had matched, there would be a second mortgage on this house right now, in my name, that I would not have known about until the first payment came due." She didn't say anything. I asked her, "Did you know?" She was quiet for a long while. Then she said, "I knew he was looking into options. I didn't know he was using your information without telling you." I studied her face. I believed part of that. I wasn't sure which part. I told her the legal situation was unchanged regardless. The house was mine. The eviction notice was valid. The hearing was in 10 days. She looked up. She asked, "Where are we supposed to go?" I told her that was a question for her husband. He had been in my house for 2 years, without contributing to its costs. If he had been saving even a fraction of what he should have been saving, they should be in reasonable shape. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She said, "He hasn't been saving." I thought about $68,000 owed to one lender. I thought about $41,000 owed to Theodore Rasmussen. I thought about $12,000 taken from Rosalind Vega's life savings. I said quietly, "Mari, he doesn't save, he takes. There's a difference. She looked at me directly for the first time in months. No measuring in her eyes. No careful distance. I could see in that look that she had already known, somewhere deep down, what I was telling her. And I could see that she had been working very hard for a very long time not to let herself finish that thought. I said, "I'm not going to tell you what to do about your marriage. But I need you to hear me clearly. What he was doing in that house was not a rough patch. He has a history that he never told you about." Then I told her, not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it. The dissolved LLC, the bankruptcy, the civil judgment, Theodore, Rasmussen, Rosalind, Vega, the pattern. She sat very still while I spoke. Color rose in her face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite anger. Something that was both. When I finished, she said in a small voice, "He told me the LLC dissolved because of a bad contract. He told me the bankruptcy was old and handled." She said, "I should have looked it up myself." I told her, "Yes, you should have, but that's a lesson for later. Right now we have a hearing in 10 days, and after that, a referral to the AG's office that I intend to file whether you are still married to him or not." She left an hour later without asking me again to change my mind. And I think that was the moment I started to believe my daughter might find her way back to herself. If you're a parent who has watched a child marry someone you didn't trust, and you stayed quiet because you didn't want to lose her, I want you to know something. Sometimes the best thing you can do is build the bridge, not burn it. Stay reachable. Stay calm. Don't push. Because the day she figures it out herself, she is going to need somewhere to walk back to. Make sure that somewhere is your house, with the lights on. The eviction hearing was held in Suffolk County Housing Court on a Thursday morning. I wore the same charcoal suit I wore to funerals and serious occasions. Diane met me outside the courtroom at 8:45, briefcase in hand, reading the opposing counsel's last filing on her phone. She didn't even look up when she said, "Walter, we're going to be fine." Travis and Marisol sat at the respondent's table with the young attorney, Brennan. Travis wore a sport coat that was a little too big in the shoulders. He didn't look at me when I came in. Marisol did. I gave her a small nod. She looked away, but her eyes were red. Judge Marina Caldwell was on the bench. She was a woman in her late 50s with the air of someone who had heard every variation of this argument and had no patience for the ones that wasted court time. Brennan argued the implied tenancy position, the same argument from his letter, 2 years of residence, domestic arrangements, eviction filed in retaliation for a personal disagreement. Diane laid down the deed, the absence of any lease, the proper service of notice under Chapter 186 of Massachusetts General Laws, the photographic evidence of unauthorized structural modifications, including the removed cabinet doors and the unpermitted paint job. She also produced a brief statement from a Boston building inspector confirming that 2 of the modifications would have required permits that were never applied for. Judge Caldwell looked at the respondent's table. She asked, "Did the respondents pay rent at any point during the 2-year occupancy?" Brennan conferred briefly. He said, "No, Your Honor, but they contributed to household expenses." Judge Caldwell looked at the exhibits. She looked at Diane. She looked at me. Then she said, "Sole ownership is documented and undisputed. No lease was executed. No rent was paid. The plaintiff provided lawful notice under state statute. The respondents made significant alterations to the property without documented consent from the owner. The claimed implied tenancy does not survive in the absence of any formal agreement." She ordered the eviction effective in 21 days. Brennan immediately moved for an extension on hardship grounds. The judge granted an additional 14 days, for a total of 35. I could live with that. I called Theodore Rasmussen from the courthouse parking garage. I told him the outcome. He said, "Good. Call me if there's anything else I can do." I told him the AG's referral would be filed within the month. He said Rosalind Vega had already called the AG's office on her own and given a statement, and the investigator had told her there were other complaints already on file from other counties. There were more victims, he said. At least 2 confirmed, possibly more. I sat with that fact for a long time, in the quiet of my truck, just looking at the concrete pillar in front of me. The mathematics of a man like Travis, the sum of how many other lives had been quietly drained to fund the life he had been trying to build on top of mine. I drove back to Roy's and told him over coffee. He asked when I would get my house back. I told him 35 days. He poured more coffee and asked, "What about Marisol?" I watched the late afternoon light come through his shop window and fall across the wood shavings on the floor. Roy keeps a clean shop. but there are always shavings. I told him I didn't know yet. Some joints can be repaired. Some you have to cut away and start fresh with new material. You don't know which one until you've cleaned the break. The 35 days pass the way waiting days always pass. Slowly at first, and faster toward the end. They left 3 days before the deadline. I knew because Roy's neighbor, who lived 2 streets over from my house in Dorchester, mentioned seeing a small U-Haul truck. I thanked him. I didn't drive past. I would see it when I returned. A week after they left, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Marisol. New phone, new number, which I understood to mean a new arrangement entirely. The text said only, "We left it clean. I'm sorry, Dad." I held the phone in my hand for a long time. I finally typed back, "I know you are. When you're ready to talk, call me." The day I returned to my house, I asked Roy to come with me. Not because I needed help carrying anything, but because some things are better witnessed. The house was clean. They had left it better than it had been the last time I'd seen it, in some ways. Dishes washed, counters wiped. But the changes were still everywhere. The missing cabinet doors, the charcoal wall in the back bedroom, the imprints in the carpet from furniture that wasn't mine, the strange absence of 40 years of accumulated life, reduced to whatever I had taken to Roy's in advance. I stood in the doorway of what had been my study, looking at the empty walls where my pegboard had hung. Roy stood beside me. He said quietly, "It's still your house, Walter." I said, "I know. That's the thing about a house. It waits." We started that day with cleaning, the deep kind. We opened every window and let the cold November air move through. I measured the wall and reinstalled the pegboard that afternoon. Hung my father's tools back in their places. The chisels, the block planes, the marking gauges, each one back in the same spot it had occupied since 1996. The room smelled again of linseed oil and old white oak. My room, my tools, my house. 3 weeks after I returned, Diane filed the referral to the Massachusetts Attorney General's Elder Fraud Division. The package included the equity inquiry documentation, the financial history I had assembled at the library, Theodore Rasmussen's written statement, and Rosalind Vega's licensing board complaint from 3 years earlier. It included a 40-month timeline I had drafted on architectural paper in my own careful handwriting. Diane told me the investigator had confirmed receipt and that my file would be reviewed alongside the existing complaints from other counties. I asked her about timing. She said investigations like this take months, sometimes more. I told her I had patience. I had always had patience. What I didn't say to her was that I had already made peace with the fact that the criminal outcome was no longer mine to control. I had built the structure. I had placed it where it needed to stand. What the law did with it from there was the law's business, not mine. What was mine was the house. I stood on my back porch one cold morning in early December, coffee in hand, looking out over the garden beds. The tomatoes were finished. The plants were pulled. I had turned the soil and added compost, and covered the beds with straw for winter. In the spring I would plant again. The folding table with the bent leg, the one Travis's friends had abandoned on the lawn months ago, I had repaired in the workshop. It was stored in the garage now, ready for the next family gathering, whenever that would be. Roy came over for dinner that Thursday night, the way he had started doing every week. I made a slow braise, low heat, the patience of hours. We ate at the kitchen table under the light I had rewired 6 years earlier, the one that took the warm bulbs I preferred. Roy asked about Marisol. She had called me the previous Sunday. A short call, careful on both sides. The conversation of two people testing the weight of a step before they put their foot down. She told me she had left Travis. She was staying with a friend in Cambridge. She had hired her own attorney and was working through the financial questions, what she was liable for and what she was not. She said she was trying to understand what the last 2 years of her life had actually been. I told her she could take whatever time she needed. She said, "I should have listened to you, Dad." I said, "Maybe. But you needed to see it for yourself." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to understand what he was doing with your house. I want to understand all of it." I told her I would tell her everything when she was ready, not to punish her, not to prove a point, but because she deserved the whole picture of the man she had trusted, and because understanding it was the only way to make sure something like it never happened to her again. I told her we would talk soon. Not yet, but soon. I told all of this to Roy over dinner, and he listened the way he always did, without unnecessary commentary. Then he said, "Walter, you're a patient man." I thought about 41 years of carpentry. about the way you read grain before you make a cut, about the way you wait for the right humidity before you join two pieces of wood that you want to hold together permanently. I said, "I'm a carpenter, Roy. We learn to work with what the material gives us." He raised his glass. I raised mine. Outside the kitchen window, the December dark settled around the house I had spent my life inside. The house that still had my name and only my name on the deed. The house that had waited for me, patient and solid, while I worked quietly 2 miles away, building the case that would put it back in my hands. I had not won cleanly. I had lost months of peace. I had lost a measure of trust in my own daughter. I had lost the version of the future I had imagined, the one where Marisol and her husband would have been part of my retirement, in a soft, ordinary way. But I had not been erased. I had not been quietly borrowed against and sold out from under myself. Here is what this story taught me, and what I want to leave you with tonight. If you are an older American, especially if you own your home outright, please do these things. Put a credit freeze on your accounts at all 3 bureaus. Never share your email password with adult children or in-laws, no matter how convenient it seems. Keep your deed in a fireproof safe and know exactly whose name is on it. If anyone in your household begins making inquiries about equity, refinancing, or a reverse mortgage without your direct involvement, treat that as a 5-alarm fire. Call an estate attorney immediately. The AARP runs a free elder fraud hotline at 877-908-3360, and they will talk you through your options without judgment. Your local Adult Protective Services office can also help, and reporting financial abuse is confidential. The mistake most people make is assuming that family members are not capable of these things. The truth is that the FBI estimates older Americans lose more than $3 billion every year to financial exploitation, and the largest category of perpetrators is family members and trusted caregivers. The shame of admitting that a child or in-law has wronged you is what these people count on. Don't give them that shame. Document everything. Move quietly. Talk to an attorney before you talk to the family member. The order matters, and here is one question I want you to ask yourself tonight, before you sleep. If something happened to you tomorrow, do you actually know who has access to your accounts, your email, your home, and your identity? If the answer is "I'm not totally sure," then please make tomorrow the day you find out. Now I want to hear from you, because this story matters less if it just lives in my head. Comment with the number 1 if you think Walter did the right thing by moving out quietly and building his case before saying a word. Comment 2 if you think his daughter Marisol deserved to be forgiven faster before the eviction hearing. Comment 3 if you have ever lived through something like this in your own family, and you are willing to share even one sentence about how it ended. And right below your number, please tell me which city or country you are watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. I genuinely love reading those comments. I read them with my morning coffee, every single morning, without fail. So tell me where you are. This is a fictional story inspired by common real-life situations involving elder financial abuse and family conflict, but it has been 100% rewritten by me in Boston to bring you something original and free of reused content. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, is entirely coincidental. If you made it this far, please give the video a like, hit that subscribe button, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for spending this hour with me. Thank you for listening with your whole heart. And remember, the work worth doing is always slower than you want it to be, and stronger for it. Good night from Boston.